Welcome to Just Minding My Business Radio, where we are moving at the speed of God, learning what we didn't know we didn't know. I'm your host, Ida Crawford.
And I'm your co-host, Ruth Haskins.
So grab a pen and paper and get ready for information that you can use.
Welcome to Just Minding My Business Media. We're happy that you're here today. I am so excited about our guests, an insider's view on blockbuster deal making and pop cultural tour de force. An Improbable Journey is a one-of-a-kind, deeply textured account of how Charles Lubar, in his role as an international tax lawyer, contributed to the success of some of the major figures in the world of film, television, and music. Charles Lubar is here today to talk to us about his new book, An Improbable Journey. Welcome, Charles. We are so excited to have you. And
I'm glad to be here, and I hope I can help you with some entertaining stories.
Yes, and there's so much to Charles. So we're going to start. How did you become a tax lawyer, international tax lawyer? Let's start.
Well, how did I become an international tax lawyer? That's actually an interesting question. My father was a lawyer in Washington, D.C. I grew up in his household with my mother, and he encouraged me to study the law, not necessarily taxation, because he said that the law was a very good grounding in almost anything I did in life. So I said, okay, and I decided to go to law school after going to Yale undergraduate. I went to Harvard Law School. When I finished law school, I went back to Washington, but by that time, my father, unfortunately, had passed away, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do. He'd left a small law firm, which I wasn't particularly interested in joining, but I did do some work there. But I had always been interested in taxation. Again, my father's attitude toward taxation was interesting. He had grown up, I guess, in the 30s when he went to law school, or even earlier, and lawyers didn't learn taxation at all. So all through his career, he felt uncomfortable about not knowing anything about taxation. So he said to me the same thing about taxation that he said to me about the law, which was, why don't you learn something about taxation? I don't care if you're a tax lawyer or not, but taxes are a way of life, unfortunately, so you better know something about them. So I took a few courses in law school, and I said, well, maybe I could get a master's degree in taxation while I was working part-time at his old law firm. And that's what I did. I got a master's degree in tax from Georgetown Law Center, which was really good. After that, I was pretty much on my own, and I had to decide what I wanted to do. And I really didn't understand that much about what it meant to be a tax lawyer. But I had the benefit of a couple of friends who I had met when I was a junior golfer and played a lot of competitive golf when I was a kid. These were men that played also at 7:30 in the morning, so I got to know them. And one turned out to be the head of a very fine law firm in Washington. And he was a tax lawyer. I called him up and I said, listen, I got a master's degree in taxation now. In fact, he had taught one of those courses. Would you be willing to talk to me about life as a tax lawyer? So he said, sure. And so I talked to him, as I did with two other lawyers who were, again, somewhat childhood friends, and they were always 20 years older than I was when we were playing golf. But this was a different time. So I went to see the lawyer. His name was Al Arendt. He was the founding partner of a very fine law firm in Washington called Arendt Fox. And he said to me, listen, if you want to be a tax lawyer, and he explained a little bit about what that meant, because I suggest you go into the U.S. government in one of the following 4 alternative roles. And here's the hierarchy. 1 is the Chief Counsel's Office of the Internal Revenue Service. 2nd is the Tax Division of the Appellate Division of the Department of Justice. 3rd was a tax court clerkship on the tax court. And 4th would be the reorganization section of the Internal Revenue Service. It just was that specific, as were the other 2 people I spoke to. So I tried first with the Chief Counsel's Office, and they did have a spot. So I went to the Tax Counsel's Office of the Chief Counsel's Office of the Internal Revenue Service. And I was there for about 3 years. And it was a fascinating experience for me. I had lots of interesting cases. I referred to one of them in the book, which was the reorganization of taxation of Lloyd's of London in the United States, which was pretty complicated and pretty interesting. In any event, I at that point I had sort of the orthodox path to becoming a tax lawyer. I had a 4-year commitment to the Internal Revenue Service, and this was about 2.5+ years after that, after I started. But during that time, I got interested in post-independence Kenya. For that reason, I was involved in a diplomatic program in Washington, D.C., and the co-chairman of the Young Adults Committee was my wife, and the chairman of the committee was and the person who introduced me to the diplomatic program was a woman, an American woman, who had married a Kenyan from the Kikuyu tribe, who was then getting a PhD in political science at George Washington University. That itself was pretty fascinating because his village in Nairobi held an auction and raised $4,000 from the sales of, I guess, all the animals that you could be looking for, goats and sheep and different types of cattle. And they raised $4,000 and sent him to a little school in Washington State called Gonzaga. And he went there as an undergraduate, graduated, then got a master's degree, and then moved across country to George Washington, and he enrolled in the PhD program. He was about finished this PhD program, but he was a fascinating character because he was really a master of many different skills. He was teaching Swahili at the Foreign Service Institute, broadcasting in Swahili on the Voice of America, teaching African politics at University of Virginia. The guy was really amazing. But instead of doing what many of the newly educated Kenyans did, Jomo Kenyatta had sent 1,000 Kenyans to the United States to get university degrees to prepare for independence. And my partner, unfortunately, didn't get one of those fellowships, so that's why his village raised the money. In any event, he decided he didn't really want to go into one of the more orthodox roles for educated Kenyans. He just wanted to go into business. So I got intrigued with what happened in post-independence Kenya and how it was developing as what appeared to me to be one of the stablest Black African states. Got independence in 1964, and this was 1968, 69, when I had made the decision to move. But I got intrigued, so we talked about what kind of businesses we would go into, and I talked to some friends of mine, and actually raised a little bit of money, just enough money to keep us surviving for a short period of time. And I moved to Nairobi with a wife and a 12-week-old baby. And I quit the Internal Revenue Service. In any event, I moved to Kenya, and there's a whole chapter of my life in Kenya, which I think is pretty interesting, pretty strange. I went over as a typical liberal American, figuring given equal opportunity, the African was as good as anyone else. And it took me about 6 months to realize that that wasn't the case. I had to face the reality of what recently emergent Black Africa was all about. I left Nairobi after a couple of years, a little over a year and a half or so. Wasn't sure what I was going to do. My wife was willing to take an experimental view in Europe. I went to about four cities where I knew some people, or at least enough to get started. I went to Zurich, I went to Rome, I went to Paris, and I went to London. And I found two interesting lawyers in London that were setting up their own entrepreneurial practice. One was a corporate transactional lawyer, and the other was a well-known entertainment lawyer. He'd been executive vice president of Warner Brothers, ran a very good practice as an entertainment lawyer. And they literally hired me off the streets because they needed a tax lawyer in setting up their little office. So when I got to London, I began to learn about the taxation system in London, which very much favored what are called the non-domiciled community. That is, in an effort after the Second World War to sort of encourage foreign people to move into London, take jobs in London, invest in the UK. They had a very favorable tax system for the non-domiciled people. And so I learned that. I learned it by osmosis because of the client base that we had in the law firm were mostly foreign. Many people in the entertainment industry who were living and working in the UK. So I got a quick education in the taxation of the non-domiciled community, which meant, of course, a broader knowledge of the taxation, the British tax system. And I found I was doing a lot of cross-border work. I had my American background, so people that had US type of problems might come to me. And likewise, British people who had lived or who were moving to the United States might come to me for the US side. And at the same time, people came to me because they needed to know if they were non-domiciled and qualified for all these beneficial tax positions. So I ended up, after 3 years with this little boutique practice, having a reasonable knowledge of people, in business people in the greater London community. So I guess I'd say that I got the US knowledge by academic background and several years with the Chief Counsel of Internal Revenue, and the UK knowledge by osmosis. Maybe that answers your question. A little long-winded, but that's the story.
That's fine. So the book, An Improbable Journey, what can people expect?
I think they can get a story. There were two themes that I had in writing this book. Maybe I should say how I happened to write the book. A lot of people had said to me, "You've had such a number of interesting stories with a lot of famous people. Why don't you just pretend you're James Joyce and do a stream of consciousness and write it all out and see what happens?" So that's what happened. And so I guess it took me probably 9 months or so to work out what I wanted to talk about, or what kind of, how I might shape the book. And I started writing. And I guess the rest is history.
And now it is out there for everybody to read. And
well, not quite yet. It'll be published on the 20th of June in the US and the 17th of August in the UK.
Oh, okay. So
and you can get it. I mean, you can get it right now. You can get it on Amazon, either under my name or under the name of the book, which is, as you said, An Improbable Journey, Music, Money, and the Law. And you can read it. You can get it on Amazon pre-pub, and you'll get it. If you're in the US, you'll get it pretty soon, I guess. And if you're outside the US, you'll get it. I don't know how they'll do that. I don't know whether you can get it before August 17th or not, but you can try.
Okay. So give us a couple of stories in the book. Just a little.
Okay, sure. Well, I guess one of the highest profile clients I had was Michael Jackson. With respect to his acquisition of a major communications group, a major publishing group in the UK, it was called ATV Music, consisted of about 6 catalogs. I think it was 6, or maybe 5. One of which was the Beatles catalog. And Michael I had done some work through a very fine entertainment lawyer in California named John Branca. I had done a small matter involving his taxation consequences of performing a show or group of shows in the UK a few years earlier. About 3 years later, John Branca called me and said, listen, we've got a really interesting and complex matter for you. And that is Michael wants to buy the Beatles catalog among 6 other companies, and we've got to buy these companies by buying the shares of the companies rather than buying the copyrights. In any event, John Branca asked me to help figure out how to do this in the situation where Michael was an individual, wanted to buy publishing interests, not so he could record them or perform them, but because as an investment. And truly, Michael understood the industry well enough to know that that would be a good investment. So he was a US citizen. His competitor in this battle to buy the catalogs was mostly, there were several others, but the main one was Paul McCartney, who, of course, wrote a good portion of the songs, and he had the writer's share, but he didn't have the copyrights. Because he and John Lennon and George Harrison and Ringo, they had sold all their songs, catalog of their songs, to Sir Lou Grade, who ran the ATV Music, mainly because of the UK tax system was somewhat confiscatory for someone like that. A performing artist living and working in the UK, the rates were very high. There were relatively few deductions. So they sold the whole catalog out and got a capital gain. So anyway, Paul McCartney wanted to buy it, but he was living and working in the UK. So the complexity for him was quite significant. There were some techniques that he could try, but they were very risky. And he was looking at effectively, as I would say it in layman's term, after-tax income to be able to finance the catalogs, pay off all the banks that would be involved in financing it, and paying tax at a corporate level as well as a personal level. Whereas I could construct something that worked for Americans. I wouldn't say it can work today. It worked then for sure. And what we did was we had Michael take these group of UK companies, non-resident of the UK, which you could do at that time under UK law, tax-free, move those companies to a residency in the Bahamas, which I did with his bank, after which Michael was able to liquidate all those companies through a particular technique and take the companies into a venture he put together in the United States. And at that time, you could do that under US law. You could do that tax-free. And not only could you do it tax-free, but the entire amount of money that you put up, which in his case was about $45 million financed by Chemical Bank, as well as his own money, you could liquidate that tax-free. And when you did that, you would get what's called a step up in basis. That is a step up to the fair market value of what you had purchased. And that meant that all the copyrights could then have a fair market value cost basis. And of course, they had almost no cost basis back home in England because all the expenditure of building those catalogs was all written off in the early years of the catalogs. So anyway, Michael could get those catalogs at almost $45 million worth of cost basis. And in the music industry, just like with real estate or with other assets that have a useful life of some period of time, you could amortize those copyrights over a period of time, which meant that every year, let's say you amortized it over 8 years, 10 years, 15 years, you could at least get a pro rata share of your cost as a deduction against the income derived from the exploitation of the copyrights. So effectively, you could earn the income, take these depreciation deductions, and have enough money, because you'd be paying very little, if any, US tax. You'd have enough money to pay off the banks. And that's the way it went.
Okay. Wow. That's a lot. Okay. And I'm sure people that understand the text in your shoes will definitely get all of that. So who else were you able to support with your skills?
Well, the other big one was the structuring for the Muppets when they set up in the UK. Again, like Michael Jackson, I did a very small bit of work for the Muppet characters through Jim Henson, who controlled the character, the copyrights in the characters when he did his deal with Sesame Street. So he had the ability to go into his own venture if he decided to do it. I'd done a tiny little bit of work. It involved an EU problem, or the European Community problem. I think it cost a few £100 just to look at the general rules for copyright protection and so forth. And then again, a couple of years later, I got a call from Al Gottesman, who was the general counsel of Henson Associates in the United States, and said, listen, Jim Henson has been trying to do a Muppet show in the United States, but we couldn't do it. No television company would finance it. But we, Al Gottesman and Jim Henson, the two drivers here, we found a UK person, Lou Grade, which ironically turned out to have been the same group of companies that Michael Jackson had been involved with. But in any event, Al Gottesman said to me, Lou Grade is prepared to finance a series, a Muppet show, for a year to see if it worked. And Chuck, I'd like you to structure this in a way that's most advantageous for not only the puppeteers, but for Jim Henson and the Henson organization or Henson company in the United States. So I took it upon myself to do that. First was the corporate structuring of how to do the filming in the UK in a way that would nonetheless get the profit element back to the United States, where I thought it belonged, because that was the creative impulse of Jim Henson and the creation of all these characters. But the UK had tough rules, and there were very high taxes when it came to earning the income off a television show that was made in the UK. And it was done in a way that allowed the profit element, the big profit element, which came eventually to the Henson Group after doing 5 years of programming and then going into syndication in the United States. It brought all the profits, most of the profits, to the US. In addition, we had to structure all the taxation of the entertainers in the UK. And he has been asked to go on to the Muppet Show. So how would you like to visit the filming of Chris Christopherson on the Muppet Show? And I said, of course. So, and I actually physically saw the filming of Chris Christopherson singing "Help Me Make It Through the Night" to Miss Piggy. And that, anybody that wants to look that up can find it on Google. It's one of the top 10 Muppet shows ever done. I mean, and Chris would play, and take the ribbon from your hair. Oh, Chris, you're so sexy. And he back and forth and back and forth. It was hysterically funny. And I'll never forget that, because it's just an event of a lifetime. And it turned out that the particular viewing that I had was one of the great Muppet shows of the history.
Wow. Wow. This book sounds amazing, Charles. I mean, amazing. Your journey has been very, very exciting. to say the least. So how can people get the book?
The best way to get the book is to go online to Amazon, and either with my name, Charles Lubar, or the name of the book, you can get it, and you can order it right now. And the release date is the 20th of June, so I imagine they'll deliver them as close to June 20th as they can.
Okay. Wow. Well, this book sounds amazing. You are amazing. Your journey, the name of the book is definitely fitting because you did a lot of things non-traditional.
Actually, the two themes, one theme is, of course, the stories of all the people I'd represented. But the second theme was what I found from talking to so many young lawyers at the Internal Revenue Service. That is the willingness to take risks in your own life and not necessarily follow the orthodox path of achievement. And I took a lot of risks. I mean, quitting the IRS and moving to Nairobi, Kenya with a wife and a 12-week-old baby 5 years after independence. That had a lot of risks.
Yeah.
Moving to Europe without a job and not even sure I was going back to the law. And then eventually, when I had a job, leaving that job and setting up my own practice in London. And then eventually I merged with two major American firms over the 50 years I've been in the UK. But all of those involved a reasonable level of risk, measured risk all the time. I mean, I wasn't shooting crap, but risks, I was evaluating the risks and taking the chance. So if that's a theme for young people in the professions, especially, who are willing to look at that or keep an openness to taking some risks, I can only say that by taking those risks, I was fortunate in becoming successful in doing so.
Yes, and we all know you got to step out. You got to get out of your comfort zone to get to the things that you're supposed to have in your life.
Well, I felt that way, and it worked for me.
Yeah.
It doesn't work for everybody, that's for sure. But I think taking those risks is worthwhile, even if you fail.
I think so too.
You failed, but you can read about that if you decide to.
Yes, I think so too. Wow, Mr. Lubar, I am so happy that we had this chat, and I'm looking forward to many more chats as this book starts to circulate around the world. And thank you so much for sharing your voice with our audience, and we look forward to doing it again.
Well, I hope so, and I've enjoyed it very much. It made me think about those particular storylines.
All righty now. So
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Just Minding My Business Radio. I'm your host, Ida Crawford.
And I'm your co-host, Ruth Haskins.
We hope you enjoyed the show and appreciate you stopping by. Many blessings to you and yours.